All right, so we're in our first chapter in Unit 2, and really this whole next unit is going to be talking about plants, and in particular, we're really going to focus on angiosperms. Do you remember what angiosperms are? Hopefully. Angiosperms are your flowering plants. So we'll talk about monocots and eudicots, different plant tissues and cells, and plant organs and organ systems, and type of growth and life cycles in this chapter. So really, we can split angiosperms into two big clades, the monocots and the eudicots. I might slip occasionally and say dicot instead of eudicot, but if you recall, eu just means true, so eudicot is true dicots. They're named for the number of seed leaves they have, which are called cotyledons. Eudicots have two cotyledons because, like, di is two, right? And monocots have how many? One cotyledon, because mono is one. So then we get to numbers of flower parts. Eudicots typically have flower parts in 4s or 5s or multiples of those, and monocots have flower parts in 3s or multiples of 3s, like 3, 6, 9, etc. As far as stem vascular bundles go, eudicots have those bundles arranged in a ring, and monocots have those bundles scattered. There's still more characteristics that separate them. So eudicots tend to have a branched taproot, and monocots tend to have fibrous roots and adventitious roots. As far as the difference between these roots, if you think about like grass, anybody who's a gardener and has ever like weeded the garden and pulled up a dandelion would have a taproot, and then a monocot would be like grass. They would have those fibrous roots. Then if we go to leaf venation, eudicots tend to have netted or branched leaf venation, and monocots have or tend to have parallel leaf venation. And then I wouldn't worry too much about the pollen because it's a little harder to see, but eudicots have 3 pores or slits in their pollen typically, and monocots have 1 pore or slit in their pollen typically. So let's go ahead and review. I've got the pictures here in kind of sets. The first set here with the seedlings. The very first picture, which hopefully you can see that, this first picture here, that is going to be what? Is it monocot or eudicot? That is this one here is a eudicot, and this one here is a monocot. If we look at this next set, on the top row still, that's maybe a little bit easier. First one with the parallel veins is a what? Monocot, and the second one, it's got net leaf venation, so that is a eudicot. Then down here we've got our flowers in flower parts in 3s, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 there, or flower parts in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. So the one with the flower parts in 3s or multiples of 3s, that's going to be a monocot, and the other one is a eudicot. This is kind of past review from alternations of generations because I know people tend to struggle. Since I'm making this video before you take your exam, I can't know for sure if you struggled, but typically people tend to struggle on alternations of generations. So which generation is the haploid generation, the gametophyte or the sporophyte generation, or both? So that's going to be the gametophyte generation, that's haploid. And then which generation is diploid? That's going to be the sporophyte generation. Which generation is multicellular? Ooh, tricky. That one's both. And then which generation is larger in flowering plants? So which generation is dominant in angiosperms is another way we could ask that question. So that's going to be B, the sporophyte generation. So if we look at the organization of plants, just like animals, plants have cells, tissues, organs, organ systems. So if we start with the cell, a cell is the smallest component of an organism that's considered living. Plants have Parenchyma, Collenchyma, and Sclerenchyma cells. They also have cells that make up their xylem and cells that make up their phloem. And then tissues, just like in animals, tissues are a group of cells that are basically working together to form a specialized function. So plants have dermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. And then plants have organs. I think when people think of organs, then they think of like a liver or a kidney or a heart or a lung, and plants definitely don't have those things. But really the definition of an organ is that you have more than one tissue type working together to carry out a particular function. So plants do have organs, like a leaf is made up of multiple tissue types. It carries out a particular function, photosynthesis. So a leaf is an organ in a plant. And then an organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform one or more functions. So all of the roots in the plant make up the root system. Like a root is an organ, and then all of the roots together make up the root system. If we look at a general plant cell, I don't think the chapter really covers too much on this, but it's worth reminding you. We talked a lot about the difference between plant and animal cells in Bio 160. So if you want to go back and review in your book or review on the previous video, you can look that up. But generally, plant cells have cell walls that are made of cellulose. Plant cells may contain chloroplast. I say may because only photosynthetic cells are going to have chloroplast. So like a plant root is not going to have a chloroplast. Plants typically have a large central vacuole, and plant cells may be specialized for particular functions. And the major types of plant cells are the Parenchyma cells, the Collenchyma cells, the Sclerenchyma cells, the water-conducting cells of the xylem, and also the sugar-conducting cells of the phloem. So if we look at the Parenchyma cells, these are the most common cell type, and they perform most of the plant's metabolic functions. They have thin, flexible primary cell walls and lack secondary cell walls. They have a large central vacuole, and these are actually alive at functional maturity, and they retain the ability to divide and differentiate into other cell types. If we look at Collenchyma cells have unevenly thickened cell walls. They tend to be grouped in strands. They help support young parts of the plant shoot, and they provide this kind of flexible support without really restraining the growth of the plant. If you've ever eaten celery before, you know, like this stringy part that you can kind of peel apart on celery, it takes a bit of chewing to get it down. That would be made up largely of Collenchyma cells. And these cells are alive at their functional maturity. That brings us to the Sclerenchyma cells. These cells have rigid cell walls because they have secondary cell walls that contain lignin, which is this very strong polymer, or at least very strong, you know, in terms of plants. And I told you the other two cell types were alive at functional maturity. Sclerenchyma cells are actually dead at their functional maturity. And there's two types, sclerids and fibers. So sclerids are short and irregular in shape. If you look at this picture here, this is your sclerid. You can see it's kind of irregular shape there. And if you've ever eaten a pear, and when you eat the pear and there's little pieces that almost feel like grainy or sandy in your mouth, those are called stone cells, and those are sclerids. Fibers are long and slender cells, and they're grouped in strands. It might not look like these are slender in this picture because this picture is a cross section. So like if my arm up and down, if we took a section of it, a cross section, the arm wouldn't look long because you would just have, man, I hope you can see the video, because you would just have a small chunk of it there. So fibers are long cells, but this particular picture of fibers, they don't look very long. Fibers are useful for making rope. If you've ever seen like a hemp necklace before, right, those are made up of hemp fibers. So the rope there is made up of those long, slender cells that are grouped in strands. So that brings us to the water-conducting cells of the xylem. These cells are dead and lignified at their functional maturity, and there's actually two types of cells in the xylem that conduct water. There's Tracheids, which are these long cells here, and they're thin, and they have these like tapered ends here, if you can see that, and they move water through pits. And then there's also vessel elements that align end to end to form a long pipe that's called a vessel. So one cell is the vessel element, the whole pipe is a vessel. And they also have perforations between the cells for water to move through. Then we've got the phloem. So phloem as a tissue contains different cells that conduct sugar in the phloem. Phloem is different than xylem for a number of reasons, but one important reason is that the cells in the phloem are alive at functional maturity. And in angiosperms, the sugars are going to be transported in sieve tubes, which are chains of cells called sieve-tube elements. And then sieve plates are the porous end walls that allow the fluid to flow between cells along the sieve tube. And sieve tube elements actually lack organelles. However, they have a neighboring cell called a companion cell whose nucleus and ribosomes serve both cells. If you think about it, like at first you're like, oh my gosh, that's really different that cell doesn't have any organelles, but how are you going to really transport a lot of material if you have all these organelles in the way. So functionally, that's kind of why they lack those organelles. And in seedless vascular plants and gymnosperms, sugars are transported through sieve cells. So if we look here at the pictures, there's your sieve tube elements in a longitudinal view. So we were talking about how the fibers looked short in the couple slides back because they were a cross section. The longitudinal view is like the long way, or slice the long way. And so here you can see the companion cell is nearby. The companion cell has a nucleus. The sieve tube elements do not actually have the nucleus. And you can see the same thing in this picture here. Here's the sieve tube element, and the companion cells are alongside of them. This is a picture that's a little bit busy at first, but I like it because it shows you the different cell types together. So you've got your Sclerenchyma cells, your Collenchyma cells, and your Parenchyma cells, and then your cells that make up your xylem, and your cells that make up your phloem, and you can see them kind of all at work in the plant there. So that one's maybe worth taking a look at just to kind of review and see where everybody fits into place. As far as regeneration of plant cells go, there's actually a region on a plant called the meristem, which is where they have undifferentiated cells, and those cells produce new tissues by way of cell division. There's two main types of meristems, apical meristems and lateral meristems. And when I say these contain stem cells, I don't mean like the cells of the plant stem. I mean like stem cells like you've probably heard of embryonic stem cells with humans before. So the apical meristem, the apex is the tip of something. So these are located at the tip of the roots and the tip of the shoots, and also at the axillary buds of shoots. Then lateral meristems, lateral is like to the side. So lateral meristems add thickness to like the trunk of a woody plant, and they're located in the vascular and Cork Cambium. So meristems help maintain youthful stem cells. So plant meristems include stem cells that remain undifferentiated but can produce new tissues, and whenever one of those cells divides, it produces another stem cell and then a cell that is a derivative that can become differentiated into a specialized cell or a different tissue type. So you keep that youthful stem cell line because every time the one cell divides, you have one that stays a stem cell and one that becomes something else. As far as plant growth goes, a plant can grow throughout its life. That's called indeterminate growth, and that is enabled by those meristems. Some plants have certain organs that cease to grow at a certain size, and we call that determinate growth. If we think about like a flower has a set size that it gets to, or a leaf typically gets to a set size, but the plant itself can grow more flowers or more leaves. So the certain organs have a set size, so they have determinate growth, but generally the plant as a whole can have indeterminate growth. And obviously there are some limits to that, but just kind of get the big idea there, I suppose. Then plants can grow with primary growth or secondary growth. Primary growth is growth in length. It elongates shoots and roots at the apical meristems, and then secondary growth is growth in like diameter or width. It adds thickness to the stems of woody plants, and that occurs at the lateral meristems. As far as plant tissue type goes, each plant organ is composed of 3 different kinds of tissues. So there's dermal tissue, vascular tissue, and ground tissue. Dermal tissue is the outer protective covering tissue. Vascular tissue is going to be made up of xylem and phloem, and it transports materials and also provides support. And ground tissue is kind of this filler tissue, but that doesn't mean it's not doing anything. That's actually where most of the plant's metabolic functions are going to be carried out. And each tissue is continuous throughout the plant, as you can see in the picture here. So if we start with dermal tissue consists of the epidermis, which is a layer of these tightly packed cells here. And there's also a cuticle in the leaves and stems that oftentimes we'll describe it as a waxy cuticle because it helps prevent water loss from the epidermis. And how waxy it is depends on the plant itself, like the particular species. And then in woody plants, there's a periderm that replaces the epidermis in older regions of the stem and roots, and you get your cork and cork cambium there. Plants can also have trichomes, which are these outgrowths here that are kind of hairy, and trichomes can have all kinds of purposes, including defense against herbivores and pathogens. They can help reflect ultraviolet radiation, all kinds of things there. And this particular plant, this is a carnivorous plant, and so its trichomes are able to help it capture its prey. That brings us to vascular tissue. So vascular tissue includes xylem and phloem, and we'll talk more about xylem and phloem coming up later in this unit, like how it actually works. But for now, we're just talking about it big picture. So xylem conducts water and dissolved minerals from the roots to the shoots in the plant, and then phloem transports sugars from a sugar source to a sugar sink. So typically we're going to say from leaves to the rest of the plant. However, if you're a plant and you're hanging out and you were doing photosynthesis, you're doing great, and then a deer comes by and eats off all your leaves, you're not going to have sugar in your leaves anymore. You're going to need to rebuild those leaves, so hopefully you have like a sugar store in your roots. So phloem is really transporting sugar from where you have it to where you need it, assuming you're a plant. The stele in the roots is a solid central vascular cylinder of xylem and phloem, and the stele of the stems and the leaves is divided into vascular bundles, which are separate strands of xylem and phloem. Then if we look at ground tissue may include cells specialized for photosynthesis, or cells specialized for short distance transport or storage or even support. In ground tissue, there's a pith that's ground tissue that's internal to the vascular tissue, and then there's a cortex, which is external to the vascular tissue. But that's not to say the cortex is the most external layer, because what's outside of the cortex? Dermal tissue. So be careful with that. You maybe have heard the word cortex before in your brain, or cortex generally means that like outer layer. So the cerebral cortex is what I was getting at with you've maybe heard cortex before in your brain. There's also like adrenal cortex. Cortex is a descriptive word that means the outer layer. And in this case, it's the outer layer of ground tissue, not the true outer layer of the plant. So be careful with that. So the basic plant organs and systems are really set up so the plant can draw resources from both above the ground and below the ground. Generally speaking, from below the ground, the plant's going to get water and minerals, and from above the ground, it needs to get carbon dioxide and light. Carbon dioxide and light in order to make carbohydrates through photosynthesis. There's exceptions to that too, right? Like some plants obtain water, they absorb it through their body and things like that. And also, I didn't include oxygen on the list, but all parts of the plant are going to need oxygen in order to do cellular respiration, but you kind of get the idea there. So if we break the plant down, the roots help to anchor the plant in the soil and also help to uptake water and minerals, and all of the roots together make up the root system. So a root is an organ. All the roots together make up the root system. The stem is going to produce leaves and branches that bear the reproductive structure. Leaves are for photosynthesis. Reproductive structures obviously make more plants. And the leaves are typically going to be flattened and specialized to do photosynthesis. And the stem and the leaves together make up the shoot, and multiple stems and leaves and flowers make up the shoot system. So I feel like this is relatively straightforward, but here's a picture of a plant in case you're having a hard time picturing it, right? So you've got the roots, which make up the root system. You've got the stem, you've got the leaves, you've got the reproductive shoots, in this case a flower, right? And then the leaves attach at something called the node, and the space between the leaves from here to here is an internode there. So if we start with the roots, a root is an organ that has several important functions. Again, it helps anchor the plant, it helps absorb water and nutrients, and it also can store carbohydrates. In some instances more than others, but generally can store carbohydrates. Roots rely on the sugar that's produced by the shoot system through photosynthesis, typically in the leaves. And in most plants, the absorption of water and minerals occurs through root hairs. So you can see on this seedling these little hairy extension on the roots there. These are thin extensions of the epidermal cells. The root hairs help to increase surface area. The more surface area they have, the more efficient they can be at water absorption. So as far as root systems go, generally you can have a taproot system or a fibrous root system. Again, a taproot system is going to typically be found in tall plants with a large shoot mass, and it has a taproot and then lateral roots that come off the side of that taproot. A fibrous root system can be found in a smaller trailing plant, and they can have adventitious roots which come from the stem. So if you've ever taken like a cutting of a plant, and you take a cutting of the plant and you put in water and it grows roots out of that stem, those are adventitious roots. And you can also have lateral roots that arise from the adventitious roots and then form their own lateral roots. So the fibrous root system just keeps branching and branching and branching. This should be relatively straightforward. I don't know if it's exactly the same picture as the last slide, but it might be. So which one is which? What's the carrot showing us? That's a what system? I even got it wrong almost there. It's not fibrous, it's a taproot system. And then this one here is a fibrous root system. So roots can be modified though. So most terrestrial plants have an association with mycorrhizal fungi, which increase the surface area of the roots and increase their nutrient absorption. And some plants have special adaptations of their roots. So pneumatophores, this is kind of interesting if you see these things sticking up here. Pneumatophores help obtain oxygen for root systems in wet habitats. You could have a storage root like this radish here that helps store energy. And then you can have strangling roots, or sometimes they're called aerial roots, which are a type of adventitious root that can surround a trunk of a different tree and get that particular plant up to like a higher level there. As far as root growth goes, the root tip is covered by a root cap, which is right here, and that helps to protect the apical meristem, which again, the apical meristem is that dividing area as the root pushes through the soil. Imagine you're a root trying to make your way in the soil. If you're a root in Missouri, you got to make your way by some rocks, right? So you need to have this protective root cap so that your cells that are dividing don't get injured. Growth in the root occurs just behind the root tip, and there's 3 zones. There's a zone of cell division. What do you think's happening there? Cell division. Good job. There's a zone of cell elongation. What do you think's happening there? Cells are getting longer. And then there's a zone of differentiation, or sometimes it's called the zone of maturation. You can tell you're in that zone because there's root hairs visible there. And then if you notice in this picture over here, it says mitotic cells. What's mitosis? Cell division, right? It's in that zone of cell division, so that makes sense there. And maybe in Bio 160 you got to see an onion root tip under the microscope, and you had to look at the phases of mitosis. Onion roots are a good thing to look at for that because the root has lots of actively dividing cells. Roots don't just grow down, right? You can have lateral roots that come out the sides as well. Lateral roots arise from the pericycle, which is the outermost layer of the vascular cylinder there. And so you can see this lateral root coming out, and it'll grow to the side there. Monocot and eudicots have slightly different roots. So again, in angiosperms, the steel in the roots is this vascular cylinder. So this middle portion here is your vascular cylinder in the roots. In eudicot plants, the xylem is in kind of this like star-like shape here, and then there's phloem between the arms of the stars. And then monocots have a core that's made up of parenchyma cells surrounded by rings of xylem and phloem. So it's a little hard to see in this picture, but xylem is there and then phloem is there. So we did roots. Let's move up the plant to the stems. So a stem is an organ that consists of nodes and internodes. Nodes, again, are where the leaves attach, and then the space between that is the internode. So leaf attaches at a node, leaf attaches at a node, the space between is the internode. You've also got the apical bud, which is the terminal bud that's located near the shoot tip. This causes elongation of a young shoot. Then you have axillary buds. If any of you know what the axilla is, it's like your armpit, right? So if we think about where's the armpit on a plant, I mean, it's kind of there, right? So axillary bud, axillary bud. So it's located in that upper angle that's formed at the leaf attachment point and the stem. And the axillary bud has the potential to form another branch or a thorn or a flower. If you look at the tissues in the stems, stems are covered in epidermis, and they have vascular bundles that run the length of the stem, and then lateral shoots develop from the stem's axillary buds on the stem surface. As far as the arrangement of the vascular bundles, it's going to be different in Eudicots and Monocots. So in Eudicots, the vascular bundles are arranged in a ring, which, if you look at this one here, you can see these vascular bundles along the outside here. And then in Monocots, the vascular bundles are scattered throughout the ground tissue. I think of this, or I remember this because I think about woody plants, like an oak tree, right, has that, the growth rings, right, and we're going to get into that more coming up, but in order to have those growth rings occur, that comes from the vascular tissue, and so you have to have it organized in those rings, whereas a monocot, like, you know, the grass in your lawn, it doesn't really get woody growth. Oh, darn, guys, my light just turned off. We'll finish this slide, though. So, like, a grass wouldn't get woody growth, so they don't have that same structure. Okay, I got the light turned back on. So some stems are modified. So some plants have modified stems with additional functions. A rhizome, this is a rhizome here, is an underground stem that sends out adventitious roots. A stolon is a horizontal stem that takes root along its length and forms new plants. And then a tuber you're probably familiar with, that's actually a thickened underground part of the stem, and that stores food like a potato. So as far as growth in the shoots go, remember primary growth is elongation. So the shoot apical meristem is this kind of dome-shaped mass of cells here, and shoot elongation occurs from the lengthening of the cells below the shoot tip. Leaf primordia are these little kind of baby leaves here. They're projections along the sides of the apical meristems that develop into leaves. And then again, axillary buds, remember axil is the armpit, so your axillary buds are typically going to be dormant due to apical dominance. However, when they're released from dormancy, they give rise to lateral shoots or branches. So if you've ever pinched off the top of some of your plants to get a bushier plant, basically you're releasing the axillary buds from apical dominance and allowing those to branch out as well, and you get your bushier plant that way. Some monocots actually have meristems located at the base of their stems and leaves, which allows for rapid growth during herbivore damage. Like, who's the monocot that would do that? It's not exactly herbivore damage, but like, do you mow your lawn ever, or have you ever seen a lawn mowed? Does the lawn grow back pretty quickly? It does, unless you cut it too short. If you cut it too short, you could have damaged the meristems, or if you have a grazing animal that grazes too close to the ground, you could damage the meristems and damage the growth of the plant. But typically, if it's not damaged, it's going to grow back relatively quickly there. So lateral is to the side, right? So lateral meristems, and secondary growth is that growth in width of a woody plant. So secondary growth is the characteristics of gymnosperms and many eudicots, but not monocots. Some monocots can get kind of woody, but they're not true wood. Like bamboo is a monocot, and it's, I mean, right, you're like, oh, it's kind of woody, but it's not true wood because it doesn't have secondary growth. So there's two lateral meristems in the vascular cambium, adds layers of vascular tissue called secondary xylem, which makes up wood, and secondary phloem. And then you have the Cork Cambium, which replaces the epidermis with periderm, which is thicker and tougher. So in the vascular cambium, it has one layer of meristematic cells, and you've got initials that increase the vascular cambium circumference and add secondary xylem to the inside and secondary phloem to the outside. So here you've got the initials that add xylem to the inside and phloem to the outside. There's elongated cells and kind of shorter cells in the vascular cambium. There's parallel orientated initials that produce tracheids and vessel elements and fibers of the xylem, and sieve-tube elements and companion cells. And then axially, there's elongated cells that are orientated to the parenchyma and fibers of the phloem. There's shorter cells that are perpendicularly orientated, and it produces vascular rays, radial files, parenchyma cells to connect the xylem and the phloem there. Secondary xylem is going to accumulate as wood and consist of tracheids, vessel elements, and fibers. And early wood is going to be formed in the spring. It's going to have thin cell walls. Those thin cell walls help maximize water delivery. And then late wood is formed in late summer and has thick cell walls, and that helps contribute to stem support. And obviously, it kind of depends on the weather in the region. So in temperate regions, the vascular cambium of perennials is going to be inactive throughout the winter there. So we can see tree rings where the late and early wood meet, and often we use tree rings to estimate a tree's age. So as a tree or woody shrub ages, you have heartwood, which is here. This is the older layers of secondary xylem. It no longer transports water and minerals. And then you have sapwood. Ooh, pointer's hard to control. You got sapwood there, which is younger in kind of the outer layers, and that still transports water through the xylem. You have young secondary phloem, which transports sugars, and then you have older secondary phloem that sloughs off and doesn't actually accumulate. The Cork Cambium gives rise to cork cells that accumulate to the exterior of the Cork Cambium, and the cork cells deposit this kind of waxy substance called suberin in their walls and then die. And the periderm consists of the Cork Cambium and the cork cells itself. And the periderm serves as a protective barrier, and it's actually impermeable to water and gases. So bark then consists of all of the tissues external to the vascular cambium, including secondary phloem and the periderm. We said the periderm was impermeable. However, that's not going to work because cells need to be able to do gas exchange. So lenticels in the periderm actually allow for gas exchange between living stem or root cells and the outside air. So let's review. Give me 2 reasons why removing large sections of bark could harm a tree. So if we remove bark, I think the one people tend to think of, just like if you removed a huge chunk of your skin, like hopefully that never happens, right? But if it does, what are you susceptible to? Infection, right? Moisture loss, those kinds of things. So if you remove a big chunk of bark, the same sort of thing can happen to a tree. They can be more susceptible to pathogens. They can be more susceptible to insects, things like that. Another big problem for a tree, if you remove a huge section of bark or a huge piece of bark, is remember that bark includes phloem, and what does phloem do? Transport sugars. So if you take a big chunk of bark off the tree, especially if you take a chunk all the way around the tree off, you really limit the tree's ability to transport sugars from the leaves to the roots. Number 8, would you expect a dandelion to have secondary growth? What's secondary growth? Growth in like girth or diameter, or woody growth. Does a dandelion have woody growth? No. So a dandelion would not have secondary growth. So that brings us to leaves. Leaf is the main photosynthetic organ of most vascular plants. Leaves have other functions as well, including gas exchange and dissipation of heat and defense in some plants. And leaves can vary in form, but generally they're flattened kind of blade and a stalk called the petiole, which joins the leaf to the stem of the plant. So again, there are some modified leaves. Some plant species have evolved to have leaves that do things like tendrils do. So tendrils are used for climbing. Spines, like the cactus there, has spines for defense. An onion is actually leaves, so you can have storage leaves, and you can have reproductive leaves as well. So in this last picture at the bottom here, each of these little plantlets pop off and become a whole new plant, which is kind of interesting. Like, they're kind of fun houseplants and kind of terrible greenhouse plants, because each of those little plantlets will become another plant. So if you have it in a greenhouse, you start to kind of hate them because they're almost like a weed there, but they're kind of fun to keep in just like your house. So tissue organization of leaves. Leaves have an epidermis. The epidermis of the leaf has stomata, which I think you've probably heard of from Bio 160. Those are the pores in the leaf that allow for gas exchange. You need gas exchange in order to do photosynthesis, right? They need to get carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. The stomata also need to be able to close. So guard cells open and close the stomata to help control water loss. The leaf mesophyll is the middle layer of the leaf. It's composed of parenchyma cells sandwiched between the upper and lower epidermis. The parenchyma cells include the palisade mesophyll and spongy mesophyll, or sometimes they're called palisade parenchyma and spongy parenchyma. The palisade cells are these long cells for photosynthesis, and the spongy mesophyll tends to be more on the bottom part of the leaf, and they're spongy, loosely arranged cells, and they're important for gas exchange. And there's also vascular tissue in the leaf, and that vascular tissue is going to be continuous with the vascular tissue throughout the rest of the plant. We already talked about leaf venation before, but here's another picture to show you leaf venation and give you some more detail. So the veins in the leaf are actually the vascular bundles, which function in the fluid transport and also provide structure in the leaf. And each vein is enclosed by a protective bundle sheath. And again, monocots and eudicots have different leaf venation patterns. Monocots tend to have parallel leaf venation, and eudicots have this branching or net leaf venation. So here's just a picture of kind of what a leaf looks like under the microscope. So you can see those palisade cells that are elongated, the spongy mesophyll here, which are quite spongy, right? Here's stomata is the hole, and then you see the cells around the hole. Those are the guard cells that open and close the stomata. And then here's a leaf vein, which has xylem and phloem in it. So there's kind of your leaf for you. So then we can classify plants based on the timing and completeness of their reproductive cycle. An annual plant completes their life cycle in a year or less. So they go from seed to flowering and seed production in 1 year or less. Biennials require 2 growing seasons, and then perennials live for many years, but oftentimes it takes more than 1 year for them to produce flowers and fruit and seeds. So number 9, list a plant organ. If I ask you that, I'm trying to give you a gift, right? So a plant organ would be like a leaf or a root or a stem could be a plant organ. Typical function of the plant organ, it depends which one you picked, but a typical function of a leaf is what? Photosynthesis. Typical function of the root is what? Anchoring, nutrient absorption, something like that. And then 11, provide an example of a modification of this organ that allows it to do a different function. So if we say leaf modification, there's storage leaves, like in the onion. There's defensive leaves, like in the cactus, the spines of that. If we talk about root, we could have a storage root. You could have aerial root, right? Different examples there. If I give you a question like that, though, I'm trying to say, like, did you pay attention? Can you tell me you learned something, right? So be careful with that. And we made it to the end. Can you believe it? So we talked about the difference between monocots and eudicots. Those make great picture questions on an exam. We talked about different plant tissues and cell types. We talked about plant organs, so again, root, stems, leaves. We talked about types of growth, so There's indeterminate and determinate growth. Indeterminate growth gets to a set, no, indeterminate growth goes continuously. Sorry, I'm trying to rush and I'm not doing very good. Determinate growth gets to a set size. So like a leaf that gets to a set size has determinate growth, but a plant that can add a whole bunch of leaves, the whole plant itself has indeterminate growth. Then we've got primary and secondary growth. Primary growth is growth in length. Secondary growth is growth in like width or girth. And don't really worry about reproductive or vegetative growth. We didn't really get into that. Then we talked about life cycles, so annual, biennial, and perennial. So annual completes reproductive cycle in 1 year, biennial 2 years, perennial lives for multiple years. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know, and we will talk more about how xylem and phloem function in upcoming chapters.